So it had been a long, long battle to get to where we are today. But of course, getting the vote only provides a route to political power, does not provide control of economic power. And as we look at the world today with the economy in the hands of rich and powerful people, you realize that there's a great deal more to be done. And that's what the second half of this program is all about. The war taught us that if you could plan to win victory, you could plan for peace. And in 1945, the people used their votes to elect a new Labour government, which was to institute a series of radical reforms. I was in the war, like many people, and war is 1% danger and 99% boredom, and the rest of the time you talk. And what we said to each other was very simple. I remember it very clearly. We said, if you can have full employment by killing the enemy, why can't you have full employment by building hospitals, building schools, recruiting nurses, recruiting teachers? Why can't you plan for peace in the way you plan for war? And it was that, a popular idea, that won the election. It wasn't the leaders. It wasn't between Churchill, the great war hero, or Attlee, a modest little man. It was because people said, we want a new world.
We want a society of free men and women, free from poverty, free from fear, able to develop to the full their faculties in cooperation with their fellows.
The nation would be turned into a welfare state, providing services for everyone that individually not all could afford. More new homes would be built. Free state schools and university education would be guaranteed as a right. And for the first time, everyone would have the right to a basic standard of health care absolutely free.
This leaflet is coming through your letterbox one day soon. Or maybe you've already had your copy. Read it carefully. It tells you what the new National Health Service is and how you can use what it offers. Hospitals and specialist services, medicines, drugs and appliances.
You couldn't have a more vivid example that in Britain you don't have to be rich to have health care. And it was all set out in a leaflet issued by the Ministry of Health in 1948. Health care is available to the National Health Service free.
Ridding its waiting rooms of the cold, unfriendly atmosphere of the old days, the hospital now boasts all the comforts of a clubroom. Hours of waiting on hard benches are a thing of the past in the hospitals of the future, where they know that the best relief for all ailments is a nice hot cup of tea.
The whole welfare state was the final fruition of the campaign for the vote started by the trade unions through the Chartists and the suffragettes and the representation of working people in Parliament. And it was a huge achievement.
The vote and the right to be represented in a trade union gave people in Britain a form of control over their whole lives. But that wasn't true across the world. For at its height, the British Empire covered 30 million square kilometres and governed almost a quarter of the world's population. But the people of the colonies had no real democratic rights themselves. The British Empire, like all empires before and since, was motivated by a determination to establish imperial control over resources and military bases.
When there was a British Empire, there was absolutely no democracy in the colonies. Empires don't bring democracy, they control people. There was no democracy in India, no democracy in what's now Pakistan, in Burma, in South Africa, and Zimbabwe when we were there.
The effect of this was to produce exactly the same response as the same system had done in Britain. The colonial peoples knew that they too
would have to organise to free themselves as we had done in Britain. Meanwhile, while the British people were told that they were carrying the white man's burden and that the sun never set in the British Empire, there were people in Britain who worked as partners with the colonial liberation movements to help them to secure their own independence from the British Empire.
Predictably, as is happening now, anyone who threatens imperial power is treated as if they were, put it mildly, a troublemaker or even a terrorist.
From India to Africa, democratic freedom movements began, and they led to revolts, both peaceful and violent. And most of the leaders ended up in prison.
Mr. Gandhi, whom I met in 1931, he was in and out of prison even though he believed in non-violence. Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, was in and out of prison. I've known all the people I've mentioned myself, and the thing about them is they were described as terrorists. And of course, perhaps the biggest terrorist of all, and I'm quoting Mrs. Thatcher, was Nelson Mandela.
But the forces of organised people behind these leaders was unstoppable, and eventually the colonisers were forced to hand over power. And who did they hand it over to? They handed over to the leaders of the movements who had been called terrorists.
Through Karachi's streets drives the Quaid-e-Azam, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Pakistan's first Governor-General. It's Karachi's first day of independence, and the crowds are out to greet him and Earl Mountbatten. On his last day as Viceroy, he is here to inaugurate the transfer of power. The garden party at Government House was an informal farewell to British rule in Kenya.
The interesting thing, when you see it properly in its historical context, these people who were seen as troublemakers all ended up having tea with the Queen as head of Commonwealth countries.